Picture yourself as a medieval woman. Each time you learned you were pregnant, the first flutter of joy was quickly shadowed by dread. Was it superstition, infection, or fate waiting to claim you? The risks were real. Maternal death haunted every household, and in cities like Florence, 1 in 5 married women died from childbirth. Even in Sparta, women who died in labour were honoured alongside fallen warriors. Tonight, let us step quietly into this forgotten world, where childbirth was not just a moment of hope, but one of history's deadliest rites, largely hidden from our records. Instead of banners and battlefields, the true struggle for life in the Middle Ages unfolded in the quietest corners of the home. The hidden battlefield of motherhood was marked not by glory or public memory, but by the private, grueling ordeal of childbirth. Here, in rooms dimly lit by flickering candles and lined with straw, women faced risks that rivaled any faced by soldiers. There were no songs to commemorate their courage. The only sounds were the hush before labour, the quiet prayers whispered for mercy, and the hope that both mother and child would see another day. For women in medieval Europe, childbirth was not only a rite of passage but a relentless gamble. The odds were rarely in their favour. Historical records and demographic studies offer a stark picture. In Florence during the early 1400s, official records from the 1427 Catasto show a maternal mortality rate of about 14.4 per 1,000 live births, roughly 1.4%. But when historians look more closely at the broader risks of childbearing, including repeated pregnancies and the cumulative dangers, they estimate that nearly 1 in 5 Florentine women died from complications related to pregnancy or childbirth over their lifetimes. This figure, drawn from the research of Herlihy and Klapisch-Zuber, brings the hidden toll into focus. The numbers are not just statistics. They represent the ever-present threat that shadowed every attempt to bring new life into the world. The dangers did not end with the mother. Archaeological evidence from medieval Warham Percy in North Yorkshire reveals that about 19% of infants died before the age of 2. These numbers speak to the immense risks that surrounded both childbirth and infancy. Each birth carried the possibility of tragedy, and families lived with the constant awareness that loss could come suddenly and without warning. What made these risks even more daunting was the near-total absence of effective medical knowledge. The causes of maternal death, especially infection, were not understood. The retention of the placenta, for instance, was a frequent and deadly complication. When a woman died after giving birth, it was rarely attributed to a specific medical cause. Instead, people spoke of fate, misfortune, or divine will. Even when a delivery seemed to go well, the days that followed could bring fever and decline, as described in ancient medical texts. A mother might appear to recover, only to be struck down by infection, what we now know as puerperal fever. The postpartum period was fraught with vulnerability, and even a normal recovery could turn suddenly fatal. The contrast between the battlefield of war and the battlefield of birth was not lost on every society. In most of medieval Europe, women's sacrifices went largely unrecorded and unrecognized. Yet there were exceptions. In Sparta, women who died in childbirth were honoured alongside men who fell in battle. A rare acknowledgement of the dangers faced by mothers, this practice stands out in the historical record, highlighting the unique recognition given by the Spartans to the life and death struggle of childbirth. Elsewhere, however, such sacrifices were seldom marked by monuments or public mourning. The vast majority of maternal deaths passed quietly, noticed only by grieving families and lost to the larger story of history. The tools and knowledge available at the time did little to tip the odds in women's favour. Concepts of sanitation and infection control were centuries away. Hands were rarely washed, and instruments used during delivery were seldom cleaned. Midwives, while often experienced, worked without an understanding of bacteria or the importance of hygiene. The absence of antibiotics, blood transfusions, surgical interventions, or even basic antiseptics meant that complications like hemorrhage, retained placenta, or obstructed labour could quickly become fatal. Infection, especially, was a silent killer. The invisible threat of bacteria entered the body during delivery, sometimes leading to a fever that would claim the mother's life in the days or weeks after birth. This single paragraph encompasses the grim reality. The lack of sanitation and medical knowledge turned even successful births into moments of danger. Birth itself was a long and unpredictable ordeal. Labour could stretch over many hours, sometimes days, without relief from pain or exhaustion. There was no anaesthesia, no pain medication, only the endurance of the woman and the support of those around her. The scene was intimate and tense. A small group, perhaps a midwife, a female relative and an anxious husband waiting outside, gathered in a cramped space hoping for a safe outcome. Each contraction brought fresh pain and uncertainty. The struggle was both physical and psychological, as the woman and her family braced for whatever might come. The dangers of childbirth were not just physical, they were emotional and social as well. Every pregnancy carried the weight of possibility, hope and dread intertwined. The risk of death was ever present, and the consequences of loss rippled through families and communities. For every mother who survived, there was the memory of those who did not. The grief was private, but the knowledge of risk was universal. Sometimes the struggle of childbirth was commemorated in ways that echo the battlefield metaphor. One vivid example is the funerary stele of Plangon, a woman depicted in labour, her struggle immortalised in stone much like a fallen soldier. This archaeological evidence reinforces the reality that childbirth was seen, at least in some cases, as a kind of combat, a fight for life that demanded courage and endurance. Yet for most women, their battles remained unrecognised. The stories of their suffering were seldom recorded, their names lost to time. The numbers left behind are sobering, but they cannot capture the full measure of what was endured. Each maternal death left a void, a missing presence at the family table, an absence felt for years to come. The hidden battlefield of motherhood shaped not only the lives of women, but the fabric of medieval society itself. The reality of these dangers was not abstract for medieval women. It was immediate, personal, and terrifying. The risks were known, if not fully understood, and they shaped the experience of pregnancy in profound ways. Every birth was a test of survival, and every mother faced it with a mixture of hope and fear. The resilience required was immense, and the courage shown by women often went without acknowledgement. As you reflect on this hidden battlefield, consider the quiet strength it demanded. The struggle for life was fought not with swords or shields, but with endurance, hope, and an acceptance of risk. The scars it left were invisible, but they were deeply felt. In the next part of our journey, we'll look more closely at what it meant to live each day with this knowledge, the daily fears and the quiet rituals that shaped the lives of pregnant women in the Middle Ages. For a pregnant woman in the Middle Ages, each day brought a quiet reckoning with risk. The knowledge of potential danger was not distant or abstract. It shaped daily life, colouring even the most ordinary routines with a sense of uncertainty. The moment a woman recognized the signs, missed cycles, subtle changes in her body, she understood she was entering a period marked by both hope and a constant underlying fear. There was little comfort in the absence of medical certainty. No one could tell her if the child within was growing safely, or if her own body would withstand the ordeal ahead. At night, these worries pressed in. She might wonder what would happen to her other children if she died, or whether her husband would remarry. Most of all, she faced the possibility that the life she carried might not survive, even if she did. These fears were not just private burdens. They echoed in the world around her, woven into the fabric of daily life. Medieval society was steeped in beliefs that blurred the boundaries between faith, superstition, and practical wisdom. For the pregnant woman, this meant navigating a landscape filled with ritual and caution. Advice and warnings came from every direction, often rooted in tradition rather than evidence. Some gestures were simple, avoiding certain foods or activities, or relying on the wisdom of older women. Others drew on deeper wells of faith and folklore. Among the most powerful sources of comfort and protection was religious devotion. The Virgin Mary, herself a mother, became a frequent focus of prayers for safe delivery. But it was St. Margaret who held a special place in the hearts of many. Her legend, emerging unscathed from the belly of a dragon, offered a symbol of hope and miraculous survival. Women invoked her name in prayer, and her image appeared in churches and on small tokens carried during labour. These acts were not empty gestures. They reflected a genuine belief in the possibility of divine intervention. Physical objects also played a role in this landscape of hope and fear. Birth girdles, strips of cloth inscribed with prayers or protective charms, were wrapped around a woman's body as she approached labour. These girdles might be kept at a church or monastery, passed down through families, or made anew for each pregnancy. Their continued use, even into the 19th century, speaks to the enduring need for comfort and a sense of agency in the face of danger. For the woman wearing one, the girdle was a tangible connection to faith, community, and the generations of women who had come before her. Rituals extended beyond objects and prayers. Midwives, whose knowledge was shaped by experience and tradition, brought their own blend of practical skill and superstition. They might scatter herbs near the birthing bed, or draw protective symbols on the walls. Some rituals drew from ancient sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon charm that called for invoking sacred words while stepping over a grave, followed by another ritual over a living man. These actions, strange to modern sensibilities, reveal the depth of anxiety and the lengths to which women and their helpers would go to ward off harm. The emotional toll of pregnancy and childbirth is captured in rare first-person accounts. Marjorie Kempe, whose writings offer a window into medieval womanhood, described her own experience with the words, "It is to me great pain and great disease." Her lament speaks for many, expressing not only physical discomfort, but also the mental strain of carrying both a child and the weight of uncertainty. Preparation for childbirth often included spiritual readiness. Confession before labour was a common ritual, a way to clear one's conscience and seek peace with God. For many, this was accompanied by the practical step of writing a will, ensuring that their wishes for their children and property would be known if the worst happened. These acts, both solemn and pragmatic, were woven into the rhythm of anticipation and anxiety. Despite the ever-present risks, daily life did not pause. Pregnant women continued their work, tending fields, caring for children, keeping households running. This perseverance was not just necessity, but a quiet form of defiance. It reflected a resilience born of necessity, a determination to move forward in spite of fear. The dangers of childbirth were acknowledged, but they did not define every moment. Instead, women found ways to carry on, drawing strength from routine, community, and faith. After childbirth, the ritual of churching marked a turning point. Following a period of 40 to 60 days of confinement, a new mother would return to the church porch for a blessing. This ceremony, described by historian David Cressy, signified both her survival and her reintegration into the community. It was a public acknowledgement of endurance and renewal, a brief moment of recognition in a life shaped by private struggle. The sense of danger was so deeply ingrained that it scarcely needed to be spoken aloud. The risks of childbirth were understood by all, a silent agreement that shaped expectations and responses. Ancient words sometimes echoed through the centuries, offering perspective on the enduring nature of these fears. This ancient Greek line, "I would rather face battle 3 times than give birth once," echoes across centuries in Medea's Stoic words, reminding us childbirth was seen by women as a true battlefield. Yet, for all the anxiety and ritual, there was also a profound sense of solidarity. The experience of pregnancy and childbirth united women across social boundaries. Shared fears and hopes created bonds that transcended individual circumstances. Through whispered prayers, the touch of a birth girdle, or the presence of a midwife, women found ways to support one another. Their resilience was not always celebrated in public, but it was real, woven into the fabric of daily life. The story of medieval pregnancy is not only one of fear and risk, but also of quiet endurance and resourcefulness. Each day brought its own blend of worry and hope, ritual and routine. The tools at hand, prayer, charms, confession and community, were imperfect, but they offered comfort in a world where certainty was rare. The courage required was not the kind that fills epic tales, but the steady, persistent kind that shapes lives and families over generations. In the end, the daily fears of a pregnant woman were met not with despair, but with action, however limited the options might have been. The rituals, prayers, and practical preparations were all attempts to tip the balance toward survival. They reflect a world where knowledge was scarce, but determination was not. When the time for birth arrived, the woman's hopes and fears converged in a single moment. The outcome was uncertain, and the danger was real. In that moment, the presence of another figure, a midwife, became central. For many, she was both a lifeline and a last resort, holding the fragile balance between danger and hope. In this world shaped by uncertainty, the midwife stood as a constant presence. She was called not only for her skill, but for her familiarity, a face known to the family, a woman trusted by the community. The midwife's role was clear from the moment labour began. She entered the birthing chamber, a space prepared and guarded by women, bringing with her a calm focus and a set of well-practiced hands. The room was dim, the air thick with anticipation, and the quiet murmurs of female relatives. Here, the midwife was expected to guide the process, to offer comfort, and to face whatever challenges might arise. Midwives learned through apprenticeship, as literacy wasn't universal in the trade. Practical knowledge came from years of observation and hands-on experience, passed down from older women who had attended dozens of births. In this way, each midwife became a living repository of techniques and remedies, some practical, some rooted in faith or tradition. She knew when to use the birthing stool, when to encourage a labouring woman to pull on a rope, and when to try different positions to help the baby descend. Aldobrandino of Siena, writing in the 13th century, advised that a woman struggling in labour might lie on her stomach with her knees drawn up, a cushion beneath her belly. These simple adjustments could mean the difference between progress and peril. The midwife's kit contained more than practical tools. Fossils like the eagle stone, believed to ease pain, might be tied to a woman's thigh. Charms and prayers were recited, invoking saints such as Saint Margaret, whose legend of emerging from the belly of a dragon inspired hope for safe delivery. Remedies blurred the line between medicine and ritual, reflecting a worldview in which the spiritual and the physical were deeply intertwined. These acts were not empty gestures. They were born of centuries of observation, hope, and the desperate need to do something, anything, in the face of danger. Yet the work of the midwife extended far beyond the technical. She was often responsible for the emotional atmosphere in the room, setting a tone of reassurance or urgency as needed. She might offer a hand to squeeze, a steady voice to follow, or a prayer whispered when words failed. The midwife's presence was a comfort, but it also reminded everyone that the outcome was never certain. The midwife's authority, however, was always precarious. Her work took place behind closed doors, away from the eyes of men and the wider community. In this privacy, suspicion sometimes grew. Some midwives, like Agnes Marshall in 1481 England, were accused of using charms, a sign of how their expertise straddled medicine and magic. The secrecy and blood of childbirth, combined with the midwife's unique knowledge, made her both respected and vulnerable. If a birth ended in tragedy, whispers could quickly turn to accusations. The expectations placed upon midwives varied sharply depending on where they lived. In France and Germany, town-employed midwives received official training and pay, their work recognised and regulated by local authorities. In contrast, English midwives often earn little and face suspicion, their status more precarious. In both cases, their pay and social standing were far below that of male physicians and surgeons, who rarely attended births except for women of the higher social status. Even then, the presence of doctors did not guarantee a safe outcome. Blanche of Anjou, queen to James II of Aragon, had physicians at her side for each of her 10 confinements, yet she died after her final delivery in 1310. The risks of childbirth cut across all social ranks, leaving even the most privileged vulnerable. Despite this, the birthing chamber remained a women's world. Female relatives and friends gathered to support the labouring mother, offering advice and encouragement, sharing in the tension and relief of each contraction. Men waited outside, their hopes pinned on the outcome, knowing that the future of the family depended on the safe arrival of a new child and the survival of its mother. The midwife, at the centre of this circle, carried the burden of both expectation and blame. The midwife's duties did not end with the delivery. She was often called upon to assess the newborn's health, to comfort the mother in the hours after birth, and to help with the first attempts at nursing. In some communities, she was expected to report any suspicions of infanticide or illegitimacy, a role that placed her at the intersection of private life and public morality. The midwife had to balance discretion with accountability, knowing that any misstep could damage her reputation or worse. Ancient and medieval texts outlined the qualities of an ideal midwife. Soranus of Ephesus, a physician whose work influenced generations, wrote that a midwife should possess a good memory and robust health. These traits reflected the demands of the role, remembering the steps and remedies that might save a life, and having the physical stamina to endure long hours at a woman's side. Yet few midwives could claim to meet such ideals. Most relied on what they had learned from their mothers and grandmothers, adapting their knowledge to the unpredictable realities of each birth. Evidence of the midwife's enduring importance can be found in artifacts like the tomb relief of Scribonia Attica, a Roman midwife whose tools are carved in stone. This image, centuries old by the Middle Ages, speaks to a tradition that survived through countless generations. Medieval midwives, too, left traces: birthing stools, herbal recipes, and the stories passed down within families. Their tools were simple, their remedies often improvised, but their presence was indispensable. The reality of medieval childbirth meant that skill and experience could only do so much. When complications arose, when a baby was positioned wrong, when labour dragged on for hours or days, when bleeding would not stop, the midwife did what she could. There were no surgical interventions, no antibiotics, no blood transfusions. Sometimes, despite every effort, a life could not be saved. The midwife shared in the grief, feeling the weight of each loss, and the silent question of whether another choice might have changed the outcome. Successes were celebrated quietly. If a mother and child survived, the midwife's work was praised in the moment, then quickly forgotten as the family turned to the demands of daily life. The realities of medieval birth were harsh and immediate, shaped by the limitations of knowledge and the unpredictability of the human body. In a small, dimly lit room, the air heavy with anticipation, a woman faced labour with little more than endurance, hope, and the guidance of her midwife. The ordeal could begin at any hour and stretch on without warning, sometimes lasting well into a second day. There was no relief from the pain, no medicine to dull it, no safe way to hasten the process except to trust in the body's own strength. Among the most feared complications was a breech birth, when the baby entered the birth canal feet or buttocks first, rather than head first. Modern medicine can often correct or safely deliver a breech baby, but in the medieval world this was a crisis. Midwives, following advice from texts like those of Aldobrandino of Siena, would try to turn the child by hand, pressing and shifting the mother's belly in hopes of guiding the baby into position. If this failed, the risks increased sharply. The labouring woman faced exhaustion, pain, and the possibility of a fatal outcome for both herself and her child. Retained placenta was another peril that haunted every birth. After the baby was delivered, the placenta needed to follow. When it did not, the threat of severe bleeding and infection loomed. The Trotula, a well-known medical text from the 12th century, described the need to remove the placenta fully and, if necessary, to stitch tears between the vagina and anus. Remedies ranged from gentle pulling on the umbilical cord to herbal concoctions meant to encourage expulsion. Yet these measures were often ineffective, and a retained placenta could quickly lead to catastrophic blood loss. There were other dangers too that could arise without warning. In some cases the baby became stuck, or labour simply stalled. The Hippocratic Corpus, written long before the medieval era but still influential, described a tragic example. A woman who suffered severe complications in her 8th month of pregnancy, with the fetus dying inside her. The text details the agony of a body unable to complete its task, the risk of infection, and the likelihood of death for the mother. Centuries later, little had changed. When a fetus was believed to have died in utero, a quick delivery became urgent. Texts advised herbal drinks containing pennyroyal or other strong plants to stimulate contractions, but these could be dangerous, sometimes causing poisoning or uncontrollable bleeding. If the mother died with the child still inside, a caesarean section might be performed, not as a means to save the mother, but as a desperate attempt to rescue the baby. These post-mortem procedures were rare and grim, carried out with sharp knives and little hope. The urgency was real, but the success rate was low. This was not a routine intervention, it was a final effort when all else had failed. The environment of birth itself offered little comfort. Cleanliness was limited to what could be achieved with water and cloth. Aldobrandino of Siena recommended bathing the mother with herb-infused water and lubricating her body with oils and fats, but these practices did little to prevent infection. Tools were reused, hands were seldom washed, and the birthing space was crowded and poorly ventilated. The understanding of what caused disease was minimal, and even the best intentions could not shield women from unseen dangers. After the child was born, the midwife cut and tied the umbilical cord with soft woolen thread, then wrapped the infant tightly in swaddling cloths. This practice aimed to keep the baby warm and protect delicate limbs, echoing a belief in the importance of recreating the safety of the womb. The newborn was placed in a cradle or basket close by. Immediate care for the infant was a priority, but the mother's ordeal was not over. For many women, the aftermath of birth brought its own set of risks. Blood loss could be severe, leaving the mother weak or unconscious. Some women never regained strength. Family members gathered, offering prayers and comfort, but there was little they could do if complications arose. Death in the birthing room was not rare. It was met with quiet acceptance, a recognition of how close the line between life and death could be. These dangers were not limited by social rank. Eleanor of Castile, Queen to Edward I of England, died in 1290 after delivering her 16th child. Her death was one of many among royal women, whose maternal mortality rates were only slightly lower than those of commoners, if at all. Wealth and status provided some advantages, such as access to more experienced midwives and physicians, but could not guarantee survival. The risks of childbirth bound all women together, regardless of their place in society. The emotional toll of repeated pregnancies and births was immense. Women faced these dangers multiple times in their lives, often with little time to recover between children. The need for large families, driven by high infant and child mortality, meant that many women bore child after child, each time confronting the same uncertainties. The strength required to endure was not just physical, but mental and emotional as well. Midwives did what they could with the knowledge and tools available. Their skills included manual techniques for repositioning babies, the application of herbal remedies, and the use of prayers and rituals to comfort and support. They followed advice from texts like the Trotula and Aldobrandino's manuals, adapting ancient wisdom to the realities before them. Yet their ability to intervene was limited. When faced with obstructed labour, severe bleeding or infection, there was often little more to do than wait and hope. The moments after birth were a fragile time. Relief at the arrival of a living child was tempered by worry for the mother's recovery. The midwife watched for signs of trouble, excessive bleeding, fever, or a retained placenta. Families hovered nearby, waiting for reassurance that the worst had passed. But the truth was, the danger was not yet over. Each birth in the Middle Ages was a confrontation with the limits of what was known and what could be done. The brutal realities of medieval childbirth were not only in the pain and the physical risks, but in the ever-present possibility that a moment of hope could turn to tragedy. The midwife's presence offered comfort, but even her experience and skill could not guarantee a safe outcome. As the birthing room quieted and the first cries of the infant faded, a new uncertainty settled in. The ordeal of labour was finished, but another threat lingered, one that was silent, invisible, and just as deadly as any complication of birth itself. Relief is brief for a woman who has survived the physical ordeal of childbirth in the Middle Ages. The baby is swaddled and close by, the room quiets, and exhausted faces slowly begin to relax. Yet, in the days that follow, a new threat often emerges, one that cannot be seen or touched, but whose effects are swift and devastating. The invisible enemy of infection waited in every corner of the medieval birthing chamber, and its arrival could turn hope into mourning without warning. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever as it was sometimes called, became a word whispered with dread among women and midwives alike. Unknown to medieval midwives, unwashed hands and reused tools spread deadly infection, called childbed fever, which historians now estimate claimed thousands of lives. The birth itself was only the beginning. The hours and days that followed were a time of uncertainty, as the mother's body, weakened from labour, faced a new and silent danger. The conditions of medieval birth made infection almost inevitable. Most women gave birth at home, attended by midwives and female relatives. The birthing room was familiar but far from clean. There was no understanding of bacteria, and no one saw the need to wash hands between deliveries or to clean the tools used to cut the umbilical cord. Linen cloths, reused time and again, harboured invisible threats. The air in the room, often heavy from closed windows and the smoke of a hearth, did little to hinder the spread of disease. Even the best-intentioned care could not prevent what they did not know existed. When infection set in, its signs were subtle at first. A lingering pain or tenderness, a fever that would not break, a sense of exhaustion beyond what was expected, these were the first warnings. The mother, who had survived the dangers of labour, began to feel worse instead of better. Her skin grew hot, her abdomen tender, and soon she might be racked with chills and sweats. In some cases the infection progressed quickly, and death followed within days. In others, it was a slow decline, marked by confusion, weakness, and despair. The connection between childbirth and infection was not understood. Medieval explanations for these fevers were rooted in ideas of imbalanced humours, divine punishment, or exposure to bad airs. Remedies focused on restoring balance or protecting the spirit. Prayers were said, relics were brought into the room, and charms were hung above the bed. These acts offered comfort but no protection against the real cause. The true enemy was invisible, lurking in the very hands meant to help and in the tools meant to heal. One of the most dangerous triggers for puerperal fever was the retention of the placenta. After birth, the placenta needed to be expelled completely. If any part remained, it became a breeding ground for bacteria. The midwife, recognizing that the placenta had not come away, might try to remove it manually. This act, though intended to save the mother, often introduced more bacteria into the body. The risk of infection increased with every attempt. Once bacteria took hold, the result was often a rapid and fatal fever. Herbal baths offered comfort but did nothing against bacterial infections. Women drank teas or soaked in infusions of mugwort or yarrow, hoping for relief. The warmth may have eased aches, but the infection continued, unchecked and unstoppable. Without antibiotics or antiseptics, there was little anyone could do once the fever began. The outcome depended on the strength of the mother's body and the severity of the infection, not on the remedies offered at her bedside. The consequences of puerperal fever reached far beyond the mother. When a woman died from infection, her newborn, if it survived, was left without its most vital source of nourishment and care. In wealthier families, a wet nurse might be found, but for most, the infant's survival became uncertain. Malnutrition and neglect often followed. The loss of a mother meant the loss of stability for the entire household. Children lost their caretaker, husbands lost their partner, and the rhythm of daily life was thrown into disarray. The scale of these losses was immense. In Florence, records show that maternal mortality climbed sharply after outbreaks of puerperal fever. The city's death registers, kept quarter by quarter, list woman after woman lost to infection in the days or weeks after delivery. These were not isolated tragedies, but part of a larger pattern that shaped the lives of families and the structure of communities. Death came not only in the poorest neighbourhoods, but also in the homes of the wealthy and powerful. Personal accounts from the era are rare, but the fear of infection is clear in the writings that survive. Marjorie Kempe, whose spiritual autobiography offers a rare glimpse into the mind of a medieval mother, described the exhaustion and anxiety that followed each of her pregnancies. She did not name childbed fever directly, but her words reflect the ever-present fear that something unseen might claim her life after delivery. For many women, the days after childbirth were a time of waiting, hoping for recovery, dreading the first signs of illness. Infection did not respect wealth or status. Noblewomen, queens, and commoners alike fell victim to the same invisible threat. Physicians and midwives could do little to help. Even when the best care available was brought to a woman's bedside, the outcome was often the same. Alexandra of Denmark, consort to King Edward VII, survived an episode of childbed fever, but many others did not. The difference between life and death was often a matter of chance. The tragedy of these deaths is sharpened by what we now know could have prevented them. Simple acts, washing hands, boiling water, cleaning tools, would have made all the difference. But for medieval women and those who cared for them, these ideas were unknown. The cycle repeated generation after generation, with each new birth carrying the same risks. Infection became part of the story of childbirth, woven into the expectations of mothers and midwives alike. The impact of maternal death from infection lingered in every part of medieval society. Families were left to mourn, to adjust, to find new ways to survive. Children grew up motherless, husbands remarried or struggled alone, and communities lost the women who held them together. The silence that followed a mother's death was heavy and lasting, felt in every corner of the home. As you picture the aftermath of these losses, imagine the rooms left quiet, the children left in the care of others, the daily routines disrupted. The invisible enemy of infection did not only claim lives, it reshaped families and communities. The cost of maternal death was measured not just in numbers, but in the emptiness that followed, in the lives forever changed by a danger they could neither see nor understand. The death of a mother in medieval Europe was more than a private sorrow. It was a sudden disruption that reached into every corner of daily life. In a society where each member of a household played a critical role, the loss of a mother set off a chain reaction of hardship. Her labour was essential, not just in caring for children, but in growing food, tending livestock, preparing meals, spinning and mending, and managing the countless small tasks that kept a family afloat. When she was gone, these responsibilities did not disappear. They simply fell to those left behind, often with devastating results. A mother's absence left infants in particular jeopardy. Without breast milk, newborns faced a high risk of malnutrition and disease. For most families, the option of hiring a wet nurse was out of reach. In the wealthier households of Florence and other cities, some mothers did employ wet nurses, but this practice was limited by cost and social norms, as well as debates about the proper care for infants, debates that stretched back to ancient writers like Soranus, who discussed the virtues and pitfalls of wet nursing. For the vast majority, however, no substitute could replace the lost nourishment and comfort a mother provided. Historical records from places like Warham Percy show that nearly 1 in 5 infants died before the age of 2. and maternal death only sharpened these odds. Orphaned infants, especially in poorer homes, were often unable to survive the first months of life. Older children, too, suffered in the wake of maternal death. The household's rhythm was thrown into disarray. Children, some barely old enough to help, had to take on adult tasks, tending animals, gathering firewood, or watching over younger siblings. This shift placed a heavy burden on small shoulders and often meant that their own health and development were neglected. The chance for childhood shrank, replaced by the daily struggle to keep the household running. Malnutrition and illness grew more likely as routines broke down and resources became stretched. For the father, the loss was both personal and practical. In the medieval world, widowers commonly remarried quickly, not only to restore emotional stability, but to re-establish the household's function. The new wife was expected to step into the role left vacant, caring for children and managing domestic labour. Yet this solution was rarely seamless. Stepchildren might be met with indifference or resentment, and the bonds of trust and affection built over years could not be replaced overnight. The pressure to remarry was driven less by sentiment and more by the urgent need to ensure the family's survival. The economic consequences of maternal death were profound, especially in agrarian communities. A mother's work was vital to the family's ability to plant, harvest, and store food. Without her, the risk of crop failure and hunger increased. Tasks that required skill and experience, such as preserving food or managing the household's small finances, could be neglected or done poorly. As a result, families could slide into poverty with alarming speed. Hunger and illness, already constant threats, became more acute. The loss of a mother often meant the loss of a family's main line of defense against hardship. Communities sometimes tried to fill the gap left by a mother's death. Neighbours might bring food or help with chores, and church parishes occasionally organised almsgiving or charity for bereaved families. Yet these gestures, however well-intentioned, were rarely enough. Most medieval villages operated at the edge of subsistence, and few had the resources to support another family for long. The safety net was thin, and support was often temporary. Extended family might take in orphaned children, but this solution brought its own problems. Relatives with households of their own struggled to absorb new mouths to feed. Orphaned children, especially those without property or inheritance, were sometimes treated as burdens or even as outsiders, their needs secondary to those of the host family. For some, parish orphanages or convents offered a last resort. These institutions were few and their resources limited. Life inside was often harsh, with strict discipline, poor nutrition, and little affection. Children who grew up in these settings faced a future marked by instability and marginalisation. Their chances of thriving were slim, and many were cast out as soon as they were old enough to work. The loss of a mother thus set in motion a cycle of vulnerability that could last a lifetime. Beyond the family, the effects of maternal death rippled outward into the community. In small villages, every household was part of a tightly woven web of mutual dependence. When one family faltered, others felt the strain. Husbands grieved while struggling to maintain daily routines, their sorrow often hidden beneath the weight of new responsibilities. Communities marked these losses quietly. Parish records might note the passing of a woman in a brief line, but the true cost was measured in the changed lives of those left behind. The psychological impact of losing a mother could linger for years, shaping the way children saw themselves and their place in the world. For noble families and aristocrats, the stakes were different but no less significant. The death of a wife could disrupt dynastic ambitions and inheritance plans. If a noblewoman died without leaving a male heir, the future of estates and titles was thrown into uncertainty. Remarriage was swift, but the emotional cost remained. Even among the wealthy, the loss of a mother destabilized households and altered the course of lives. Despite the frequency of maternal death, it was rarely spoken of as an extraordinary tragedy. Instead, it was understood as an ever-present risk, a shadow that hovered over every pregnancy and birth. Women faced this reality with a mix of resignation and resilience, knowing that their own survival was never guaranteed. Their sacrifices were seldom commemorated, and their stories often faded into the background of daily life. Yet the consequences of their loss were unmistakable, written in the struggles of their families and the shifting fortunes of their communities. The consequences of maternal death were not limited to immediate survival. Over time, the loss of women's knowledge and skills eroded the continuity of traditions. Recipes, remedies, and stories passed from mother to daughter were sometimes lost in a single generation. The wisdom that guided households, shaped gardens, and cared for the sick could vanish, leaving families less prepared for the challenges ahead. The death of a mother was not only a personal loss, but a blow to the shared memory and resilience of a community. The struggle to adapt to these losses shaped the rhythm of medieval life. Children grew up quickly, learning to fend for themselves or to rely on the charity of others. Fathers balanced grief with the need to provide, sometimes becoming distant or overwhelmed. Families that once thrived could find themselves on the edge of collapse, their fortunes changed by a single event. The scars of maternal death marked not just the survivors, but the generations that followed. Maternal death fractured both private lives and social structures, its impact echoing far beyond the birthing room. The search for ways to prevent such losses became a quiet but persistent current in medieval society. In the absence of effective medicine, families and communities turned to whatever means they could find, rituals, remedies, and beliefs that promised even a small hope of survival. The memory of loss lingered in every household, shaping the choices and customs of those who remained. As the day's work continued and night fell once more, the need for hope and protection grew stronger. In the face of so much uncertainty, people reached for anything that might offer comfort or control. The next time a woman went into labour, the household gathered whatever resources it could: herbs, prayers, amulets, and charms, hoping to ward off the dangers that had claimed so many before. In a medieval birthing room, uncertainty shaped every decision. When medical knowledge was limited and physicians rarely entered the world of childbirth, women and their communities relied on a patchwork of remedies and beliefs to navigate the dangers of labour. The practices that emerged from this environment were not merely habits, they were lifelines, shaped by desperation and the need to find meaning or hope in the face of real risk. Official medical advice on childbirth was scarce. Most women never saw a physician, as birth was largely considered a natural and female domain. The few medical texts that did address childbirth, like the Trotula or Aldobrandino of Siena's 13th century manual, offered a handful of recommendations, but these were often out of reach for ordinary families. The Trotula, for example, described how to stitch a tear between the vagina and the anus, or how to deal with a retained placenta, but the more common advice focused on preparation, bathing in water steeped with herbs, and lubricating the legs and thighs with chamomile oil and chicken fat in the weeks before birth. These measures, while grounded in the best knowledge available at the time, were as much about ritual comfort as they were about physical effect. The Virgin Mary, seen as the ultimate mother, was invoked in prayers for safe delivery. Yet it was St. Margaret who became the most prominent protector of women in labour. Her legend, surviving a dragon and emerging whole, resonated deeply with women facing the dangers of childbirth. Small relics, images, and even written prayers invoking St. Margaret's aid were common companions in the birthing chamber. One of the most distinctive and enduring artifacts of medieval childbirth was the birthing girdle. These long strips of cloth, frequently inscribed with prayers, invocations to saints, and sometimes magical symbols, were worn wrapped around the mother's body as labour approached. The girdle was meant to bring divine protection and ease the pains of delivery. In some cases, the text woven or written onto the girdle included appeals to Saint Margaret or the Virgin Mary, as well as lines from the Gospels or the Lord's Prayer. The act of wearing the girdle was both a gesture of faith and a practical attempt to claim any possible advantage. These objects were valued across social classes. Wealthy women might have elaborate silk girdles, while poorer women used simpler cloths, but the intention was the same. The presence of birth girdles was not limited to the birthing chamber. Some were kept at local churches or monasteries, available for women in the community to borrow as needed. Others became family heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter across generations. The tactile comfort of the girdle, its weight and warmth, offered reassurance even when its efficacy could not be measured. In a world where childbirth could so easily end in tragedy, the need for reassurance was powerful. Alongside girdles, women sometimes carried small statues or relics of saints, or wore amulets believed to protect against evil. These objects could be as simple as a piece of cloth touched to a shrine, or as elaborate as a carved image of St. Margaret. Their value lay not in their material, but in the hope they represented. Even objects without explicit religious associations, such as a silk mattress donated by Empress Matilda during illness, became imbued with meaning and were treasured for their perceived connection to comfort and healing. Charms and spoken prayers also played a role, though these were often woven into the fabric of daily life rather than reserved solely for childbirth. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, charms for childbirth drew on a blend of Christian and older pagan elements. Reciting the right words in the right order was believed to have real power, and the act of speaking these charms became a way for women to assert agency in a moment of profound vulnerability. These rituals, already touched on earlier, reinforced the sense of community among the women present and provided a shared script for facing the unknown. Herbal remedies, too, straddled the line between practical medicine and superstition. A 15th century English manuscript recommended that a labouring woman drink hyssop in hot water, a herb thought to aid breathing and calm the body. Other instructions advised using wine or water that had washed a bowl inscribed with the Lord's Prayer, merging the physical and the spiritual into a single act of hope. The belief that sacred words could infuse a liquid with protective power was not unique to one region or social class. It reflected a broader conviction that the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were porous, especially at moments of crisis. The use of eagle stones, smooth fossils believed to ease labour, was another example of the way natural objects became part of the birthing ritual. Tied to a woman's thigh or placed nearby, these stones were thought to attract positive forces and ward off harm. Other items, such as relics or pieces of wood considered sacred, might be brought into the room for similar reasons. These objects did not promise safety, but they offered a sense of connection to something larger than the immediate danger. Sometimes the search for effective remedies led to practices that now seem unusual or symbolic. The boundaries between practical advice and superstition were not always clear. A woman might be encouraged to bathe in herb-infused water, as advised by Aldobrandino, or to keep a relic close at hand. She might also participate in rituals that involved reciting prayers or charms, but these were often simple and direct. A whispered invocation, a touch of a girdle, the placing of a saint's image on the pillow. The complexity of these rituals varied, but their purpose was always the same: to offer comfort, to invoke protection, and to create a sense of order in an unpredictable world. The period following birth also carried its own rituals. After weeks of confinement, the mother was welcomed back into the community through the rite of churching. Meeting the priest at the church porch, she was sprinkled with holy water, made an offering, and received Mass. This ritual marked her survival and return, providing a moment for celebration and relief. For many, it was a rare public acknowledgement of the dangers faced and overcome. The rituals became a language for expressing care, anxiety, and solidarity, binding women together across generations. The persistence of these remedies, even in the face of frequent tragedy, speaks to the strength and resilience of medieval women. They did not simply accept their fate, but sought every possible means to protect themselves and their children, drawing on whatever resources their culture and community could provide. The birthing room was a place of vulnerability, but also of ingenuity and determination. As we reflect on these practices, it is important to recognize what they reveal about the medieval experience of childbirth. Remedies and superstitions were not signs of ignorance, but responses to a world where knowledge was limited and danger was ever present. They offered women a sense of participation in their own fate and a way to find meaning in moments of uncertainty. The stories of these remedies and the women who relied on them often go unrecorded in the official histories. While battles and public events fill the chronicles, the quiet struggles of childbirth remain in the background, their significance overlooked. Yet the persistence of such rituals reminds us that the need for hope and protection is universal, especially when confronting the unknown. The silence that surrounds these stories is not accidental. The struggles and resourcefulness of women in the birthing room rarely found their way into the annals of history. They reveal the ways in which women met uncertainty with courage and creativity. Their efforts, largely unrecognized, shape the course of countless lives and deserve a place in our understanding of the past. The question remains, why do we remember the warriors but forget the mothers? We mourn our soldiers, yet history barely notes mothers who died bringing life into the world. The chronicles of the past are filled with the names of men who fell in battle, their sacrifices preserved in stone and song. But the women who face the dangers of childbirth, often alone, often unrecorded, have faded into the margins. Their struggles, though no less real or costly, rarely found a place in the stories that shaped our understanding of history. Childbirth in the medieval and ancient worlds was seen as a private ordeal, confined to the home and attended by women. This separation from public life meant that the risks and losses bound to it were also kept behind closed doors. The deaths of mothers, whether in a grand manor or a humble cottage, were registered in parish books or family accounts, but seldom did they become part of the broader narrative. The focus remained on the heirs produced, not the cost at which they arrived. In this way, the sacrifices of women, physical, emotional, and often fatal, were quietly absorbed into the background of daily life. This silence was not accidental. The men who wrote history, who decided what was worth recording, turned their attention to wars, treaties, and the rise and fall of rulers. The domestic sphere, where women's most profound struggles took place, was left unexamined. Even when the loss of a mother reshaped the fate of a dynasty, or left a family in crisis, the event was usually reduced to a brief mention. In Florence, for example, the death registers list the passing of women in childbirth with little more than a name and date. The human stories behind those entries, the grief, the upheaval, the lost futures, are left unspoken. Maternal death was common enough to be expected, and so it rarely inspired the kind of commemoration reserved for public acts of heroism. There were rare exceptions. In ancient Greece, the funerary stele of Plangon stands out as a poignant reminder of what was endured. Plangon is shown in labour, surrounded by midwives and her husband, her posture echoing the fallen warriors depicted elsewhere in Greek art. The relief does not hide the struggle, it places her battle at the centre, recognising childbirth as a form of combat. The presence of her attendants underscores the communal nature of this ordeal, a reminder that bringing new life into the world was never a solitary act. Yet monuments like this are vanishingly rare. Most women who died in childbirth left no marker, no image, no inscription to carry their story forward. The practice of honouring women who died in childbirth reached its fullest recognition in Sparta. There, the deadliest ordeal a woman could face was given the same respect as the battlefield. Women who died in labour received burials and commemorations equal to those of men who fell in war. Their names were inscribed on grave stelae, their sacrifice acknowledged as essential to the survival and strength of the community. This tradition stands almost alone in the ancient world. Outside of Sparta, few societies offered such recognition, and most allowed maternal deaths to pass with little more than private mourning. Elsewhere, even among the elite, the stories of women lost in childbirth rarely rose above a footnote. Queens and noble women, whose marriages and children shaped the destinies of kingdoms, often disappeared from the record after their deaths. Their lives were measured by their ability to bear heirs, but their deaths in the process were seen as unfortunate, not heroic. Blanche of Castile and Eleanor of Aquitaine, both mothers of dynasties, are remembered for the sons they bore and the political alliances they secured, not for the dangers they faced or the losses they endured. Their suffering was accepted as part of the natural order, not as a sacrifice worthy of public memory. A single story sometimes breaks through this pattern. Empress Matilda, after surviving a difficult delivery, donated the silk mattress she had used to a leprosy hospital. This act, recorded in the Bai family account, transformed a personal object into a symbol of comfort and healing for others. The mattress, once a luxury, became a relic of resilience and hope, yet even this gesture is a rare exception, tucked into the corners of historical record rather than celebrated in the way that military victories or royal decrees were. The marginalisation of maternal death reflects a broader pattern in historical writing. The boundaries of what was considered important excluded the private, domestic and feminine. The birthing room, attended by women and marked by secrecy, became a space where stories were rarely told beyond those present. When tragedy struck, it was met with quiet grief rather than public lament. The memories of mothers lost in childbirth often faded within a generation. Their absence felt, but their stories seldom retold. The consequences of this silence are profound. Without the stories of women who risked and lost their lives in childbirth, our understanding of the past is incomplete. The daily realities of life, the building of families, the survival of children, the rhythms of home and work, rested on the shoulders of women whose struggles went unremarked. The cost of their absence was measured in orphaned children, disrupted households, and communities forced to adapt to sudden loss. Yet the broader histories, the ones that have come down to us, rarely pause to consider these impacts. Objects associated with childbirth sometimes became tokens of memory, carrying echoes of the women who used them. The silk mattress of Empress Matilda, for example, became a symbol of comfort and a source of hope for the sick. In other cases, birth girdles and relics of saints were passed down through generations, their significance known only within families or small communities. These items remind us that childbirth was not only a personal ordeal, but also a shared experience, one that shaped the lives of many beyond the mother herself. Visual representations too offer fleeting glimpses into this hidden history. The grave stele of Plangun, with its depiction of a woman in labour, stands in contrast to the martial monuments that dominate ancient cemeteries. Where one celebrates conquest, the other acknowledges endurance. These rare images challenge us to see childbirth as a form of struggle worthy of recognition, to understand that the risks faced by women were as real and as consequential as any faced by men on the battlefield. Yet, for most of history, such recognition remained the exception. The deaths of mothers were mourned in private, their stories carried forward only in the memories of those who loved them. The public face of history, its monuments, its chronicles, its ceremonies, remained turned toward the exploits of men. The result is a record that undervalues the contributions of women, that overlooks the dangers they faced, and that leaves us with a skewed sense of what shaped the world we inherit. This imbalance is not merely a matter of numbers. It shapes how we understand courage, sacrifice, and the foundations of society itself. The risks women took in bearing children were not less significant than those faced in war. They were simply less visible. The absence of their stories from our histories has narrowed our view of what it meant to live and to die in the past. To look back is to see the countless unnamed women whose lives ended in childbirth, their losses absorbed into the fabric of daily existence. Their absence left marks on families, on communities, and on the course of history itself. The children they left behind, the households thrown into uncertainty, the traditions interrupted, these were the real consequences of maternal death, consequences that shaped the world in ways both seen and unseen. If we shift our focus, even briefly, we begin to see the outlines of a different history, one in which the struggles of women are not confined to the shadows, but recognized as central to the story of humanity. The few fragments that survive, the names on Spartan gravestones, the image of Plangun, the story of Matilda's mattress, invite us to reconsider what we value and remember. They remind us that the act of bringing life into the world was a profound risk, one that deserves to be acknowledged alongside the risks of battle and statecraft. As you reflect on these forgotten struggles, consider how the act of giving life was a quiet battle, fought again and again with consequences that shaped every generation. How different might our history look if those births had been recorded as boldly as battles? Yet within these struggles, we also find stories of resilience, solidarity, and quiet courage. The support of midwives, family, and friends formed an essential network, helping women navigate the uncertainties of birth. If these stories of silent courage moved you, take a moment to reflect on the enduring strength of women throughout history.